Good morning. I'm Dave Seibert, an educator at the Coastal Studies Institute in the Outer Banks of North Carolina.
And I'm Parker. I'm also an educator at CSI. Today we're going to give you a quick tour of CSI and then focus on two parts of two different programs that we are able to offer virtually this fall. They will focus on Shipwrecks off of North Carolina, and then we will change focus to creating electricity from ocean waves and currents. So here's a quick video tour to get things started. Welcome to the Coastal Studies Institute on the ECU Outer Banks campus. At CSI, the coast is what brings researchers and educators together from all disciplines: ecologists, social scientists, geologists, archaeologists, engineers, and oceanographers. Through CSI's virtual education programs available to students far and wide, you can take a closer look at underwater shipwrecks and explore the rich maritime history of the Outer Banks. Find out the latest in renewable energy research as coastal engineers explore how they are working to harness the power of the Gulf Stream, and see how the ever-changing coast is affecting life in our communities. Understand the ways in which we can become more resilient. No matter what your interests are, you will find something fascinating going on at CSI.
Great. Now that you've seen a little bit about CSI, keep in mind that our K-12 programs, we offer virtual programs like this that are live, like we're talking to you today. We also have short videos that show how to do science experiments in your own home. We have videos that explain what our scientists do. We have lesson plans, and we have student activities. It's all available on our website, and it's free and open to anyone. But for today's program, we want to remind you all that there is a chat box where you can enter in questions, and we'll take all those questions at the end.
Right, but back to today's focus. North Carolina is home to some amazing ocean resources. The shape of our coastline, as well as shipping lanes, the continental shelf, and ocean currents, water depths, and temperatures all play a large role in why we have so many shipwrecks, as well as why we have such a large potential for ocean energy.
That's right, and there's thousands of shipwrecks off of our coast. They can be fully exposed on the beaches, or they can be so deep that divers can't visit them. And so there are so many shipwrecks because, like Parker said, we do have deep water right off our coast, and we have a lot of shoaling that takes place. And so ships have stranded because of those shoals. They've sunk during storms, and they've also been torpedoed by German submarines in World War II.
Sounds like there is plenty for us to learn.
Yeah, let's start by talking about how we might go about finding a shipwreck. So when we know a ship is missing, and we do a little bit of research and find out where it might be in the ocean, the next step is to try to narrow down within a few miles where we might see the ship underwater. And so in the picture on the top left, you can see us deploying a side scan sonar. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to take kind of a picture of the ocean floor, but in a larger image. And it will identify some targets or some places we're not really sure what it is on the bottom, and we might need to go take a closer look. Once we have those targets, we can use an autonomous underwater vehicle, which is the bottom picture. And so that is like, it's not controlled by anyone. There's not someone steering it. There's not someone inside of there. So it is like a drone that they program and put in the water, and then it will run a specific pattern and come back up to the surface, and it needs to be picked up to get all that data that is collected during its mission. And then on the picture on the right, you can see is an underwater robot called an ROV. And unlike the AUV, the ROV is actually attached to the ship. It has a pilot that steers it, and we're getting data as the ROV is looking at things and collecting information. So that happens in real time, that they can get that information and get some idea of what they're seeing underwater. And so we would use all that different technology to locate them and to figure out where they might be. And then, if it's possible, we would want to use divers and do something called Scuba, or self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Now, Parker, if we were going to go diving, what's something that you would want to take with you?
Air.
Air.
Sure.
We want to take some air.
Something to breathe.
So the way that we can do that in scuba diving is to fill up a tank like this. This is an aluminum tank. And so inside this tank is the air that we have in the atmosphere. It's just been compressed down and put in this tank at 3,000 pounds per square inch. Now the air in the atmosphere hopefully everyone remembers this. It's 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen and 1% inert gas. And that's what's in this tank right now. It's been compressed and pushed in there. And so then we can open up the tank, and the air is going to flow out the tank at that high pressure. And this thing on top is called a regulator, and it reduces the pressure, and it's going to flow down these hoses to other parts. But let's open the tank up first. So our tank, the air is now flowing down into these regulators. Here, Parker, we'll give you one too. And these regulators only provide air when you breathe or push the button on the outside called the purge button. So it's not, right now there's no air coming out, it's only when we breathe in. And so this tank can last a while, up to an hour, hour and 15 minutes underwater, depending how deep and who's breathing it, because it only gives us the air as we need it. But why are there two? What do you think?
Maybe in case one malfunctions, that way I don't have to jet back up.
Good. So we do like some redundancy when we're underwater because we're in an environment we're not really meant to be in, and so we need to take everything we need to survive down there. And so if one was to break, we have a second one, or if we were diving together and I run out of air, then you could give me your second one, and hopefully that would be enough to get me back to the surface.
Great.
Within our tank here, we also have some gauges, and so we have two gauges. One is a gauge of how much air is in this tank. Obviously, we'd want to keep really close track of that. And the other gauge tells us how deep we are underwater. And we know that as we go underwater, the pressure increases, which is going to change how our body uses different gases. And so there's a whole table and mathematical equation that you can use to figure out how deep you are, how long you can stay before you would start taking bigger risks on your anatomy and taking in too much nitrogen.
What's this one do?
We're going to talk about that one. So this is going to keep us alive underwater, but we need a way to attach it to ourselves. And so we have this fun thing called a BC. Oh, almost. So this is called a buoyancy compensator. And so that term buoyancy has to do with whether things float or sink. And as a scuba diver, sometimes you would want to float and sometimes you would want to sink. So we're going to plug in our tank to our BC. There you go. And so one thing Parker can do now is she can add air to her BC to make her take up more space. Perfect. And so as she's doing that, she's displacing more water. She's moving more water, which is essentially going to make her lighter and come to the surface. If she wanted to go down to the bottom, she would let air out. And if she was in water, she would sink to the bottom. Perfect. And then sometimes as a scuba diver, you want to be neutrally buoyant, which means you're not floating and you're not sinking, that you're staying right in the middle, just like Parker's showing us. And so this piece of equipment allows you to be able to go to the bottom, the top, or stay in the middle. It all has to do with buoyancy and displacement of water. We're going to unplug you. All right. Anything else you might want to bring?
Something to help me see a little bit better.
Okay. Perfect. So we have a mask, and so what our mask can do is it provides an airspace in between Parker's eyes and the water. And so if you've ever opened up your eyes in a pool, you know that it's very blurry and it's hard to see, and that's because we actually need air for our eyes to focus. So, so the mask here provides that airspace for Parker. It's going to make a tight seal, hopefully. I usually don't wear glasses underneath, but you make a tight seal, and that keeps your air in and the water out. And then you have this nice nose piece there so that you can clear your ears, because like we talked about, the pressure increases as you go down, and you need to clear your air spaces or equalize them so you don't have too much pressure inside your head.
Great.
All right, besides the mask, is there anything else we'd want to bring?
Something to help me swim a little bit better might be helpful, especially with some strong currents.
So we have fins, fins attached to your feet. They help us move through the water, propel. Like Parker just said, we have a lot of currents out here in North Carolina. We're actually going to talk about that a little bit later for our ocean energy one. And those fins will help move you through the water when you're wearing all this equipment, because it is a little bit more difficult. And lastly, anything else before we go?
Well, I get cold pretty easily, so maybe something to keep me warm would be helpful.
Perfect. So we have this nice wetsuit here. And the way that a wetsuit works, it's going to trap water in between the wetsuit and your skin, and as your body heat warms the water up, it's going to actually make it like a little hot tub in there and make you warmer as you dive underwater. And so these wetsuits come really thin for warm water diving, and then they can get really thick when it's colder water diving. So you can use these all the way down to, You know, some people have dove them in 40 degrees, so you can go in very cold water, and the wetsuit allows you to survive and be okay underwater. Perfect. So I think we have all the gear that we need. We are going to talk about the ship we're going to dive on now and understand a little bit about where our plan is to go. So our mock dive, or our virtual dive today, is going to be on a ship called the Dixie Arrow. The Dixie Arrow is built in 1921 in New York. It was used to move oil. It serviced some of the largest oil centers in the United States. It sank by a German submarine called the U-71, fired 2 torpedoes on March 26, 1942, and it sank to the bottom with 22 survivors of the 33-man crew. And so at that time, it was carrying a lot of oil. It had 86,000 barrels of crude oil. And so it was right off the coast of Cape Hatteras, and it sank as part of World War II.
Great. And now that it sank, it's rests about 15 miles south of the Hatteras Inlet and is found in about 90 feet of water. What's really special about this vessel is that it sits upright and intact, meaning it's really awesome to explore. And it's over 400 feet long and over 60 feet wide.
Excellent. So we know what we need to bring and we know where we're going. One last thing we should talk about is actually getting off the boat and getting back on the boat, because all this equipment weighs quite a lot. And so we're actually going to show you some divers getting in the water. So you can see they actually have 2 tanks on. They have equipment in their hands. They do what's called a giant stride, where they jump off of the boat holding onto all that equipment, and then they're going to start letting air out of their BCs so they can be negatively buoyant. And then they come back up. They're positively buoyant, so they've added air to their BCs. And then this is the hardest part, climbing up that ladder as the boat's moving around with all that heavy equipment. And so it's just good to be aware when you have all that stuff on, how you're moving, and make sure you don't accidentally hurt yourself or someone else. But now that we've got it out of the way, we're actually going to take our dive.
Yep. And so the next part is making our way down to the shipwreck. Sometimes it's really nice and easy to get down to the bottom, but often here in North Carolina, there is a lot of current, which can make it really challenging to land where you want to go. So the rule is that you hang on to an anchor line until you get down to the shipwreck. And today, that's going to mean dropping to about 100 feet underwater.
Perfect. So here we are on the Dixie Arrow, one of the best shipwrecks in North Carolina. And you can see here that, like Parker was saying earlier, it sits right on the bottom, and it sits up really high off of the bottom. And so that creates a space, we call it relief, where a lot of fish will be attracted to this area. It provides habitat for smaller things to live and larger fish to come in. We're seeing an archaeologist right here. So our archaeologist is diving and working at the same time. And so while we talked about scuba diving before, we were kind of talking about it in the way of just diving and being okay underwater. But these divers are actually doing work. And so they have things they need to accomplish while they're underwater. They have tools they need to use. Some of them are doing math. Some of them are drawing. They're measuring using tape. And so it's a whole different skill set that you develop in order to not just be underwater and be okay, but to actually be able to do work while you're doing all those different things. And so here we are swimming towards the bow of the Dixie Arrow, and you can see that there is a lot of fish and life attracted to the site. And so there's lots of corals and algae and things that are growing on the wreck, giving it some color. And then a lot of smaller fish, we call those bait fish, that are in big schools. And then we're going to see some predators too that will come in and use this ecosystem and try to catch those smaller fish for their prey items. And so this shipwreck provides an entire ecosystem just being out there and giving habitat to things that can live on it. You can also see those tape measures on the bottom there. And so our archaeologists are measuring things by having one end attached to the wreck, and they'll drag it down to the other end. And then they'll not just draw what they see, but draw it to scale. And so they'll know how big things are and then draw things underwater based on what they're seeing. But Parker, how do you go about drawing underwater?
Seems like it would be a little tricky. I would imagine you'd have to have some sort of special paper maybe to make sure it doesn't dissolve or deteriorate underwater.
That's right. And so they have a special plastic-based paper that they use, but they use just a regular number 2 pencil. And so their number 2 pencil is actually the mechanical kind. So if they were to break their point underwater 100 feet down, they wouldn't have to swim all the way back to the surface to get it sharpened. They have the mechanical kind that they can continue to sharpen. And so they use that on things called slates, which are basically clipboards that they attach their paper to so it doesn't disappear on them. And then they can write on those slates and bring all that information back to the surface. So here we see some boilers for the shipwreck. The boilers are really come pretty high off of the bottom, and a lot of life is usually attached to those boilers and things swimming around it. Each team in the water here that's conducting archaeology and collecting this data, they're working together. And so divers always have a buddy, and then when they come back up to the surface, they'll combine all their efforts and have a really good idea of all the things that are down there. And so a lot of the shipwreck we've seen so far has been really kind of put together and high off the bottom. There's also parts where it's kind of broken up and it doesn't stick quite as high off the bottom. It's kind of more of a debris field. So here on the swim up to the bow, we start to see some of our predators we've been talking about. There's a barracuda. We just saw some amberjack earlier. They're larger species of fish that come and utilize this area. We've talked a lot about gear. If you look at this diver, they're actually using a different system. You might notice they're not making any bubbles. And so unlike the tank we talked about earlier, the single tank, that diver has what's called a rebreather. So what happens is as he exhales, the special equipment takes the CO2 out of the air and adds oxygen back in, and then he's going to breathe that same breath again, which is why it's called a rebreather. And so that way that he doesn't exhale anything to the environment, and then he doesn't need as big of tanks to take down there with him. And
if he's not making any bubbles, does that make it quieter too?
it's very quiet, yep, and so we don't disturb things like these sand tiger sharks when we use rebreathers because we're not putting anything into the water. That's kind of, so in my mind, we look like big sea turtles underwater. And so we're not really making any bubbles or any noise. And so the sharks are very friendly and like to get very close, which is good for videography and if we're doing research. Like the aquarium that does research on sand tiger sharks. And so if you look at the side of the sand tiger shark, you'll notice some brown spots. And so there's a program called Spot a Shark where you can take pictures of those brown spots and send it into a database, and they can actually identify different sharks based on the spot pattern. It's like a fingerprint in that each shark has a different spot pattern. And then lastly, this is going to be another type of animal called a stingray that's going to swim away. They live off of the wreck in the sand. And so here we are leaving the bow of the ship, the bow of the Dixie Arrow. We're going to head back up, and now we're dry and in the studio.
Magic.
Perfect.
So just as quickly as we reappeared back in the studio, now we're going to switch topics. Next, we're going to cover ocean energy. And while the ocean has a lot of exciting things to teach us on those wrecks, we're also interested in how ocean energy is available in the ocean to power our lights and homes here on the ground.
That's right. And so ocean energy has been a focus of CSI since 2008. And we're really interested in adding ocean energy to the current alternative energy portfolio. And so looking at this graph, we can see that our energy consumption in the United States in 2019, what percentages came from different things. And if you look at the petroleum or the fossil fuel products, you can see that majority of our energy consumption comes from fossil fuels, with only 11% coming from renewable energy. Parker, why would we need to use more alternative energies?
Well, that's because fossil fuels are pretty limited. Those fossil fuels include coal, oil, and natural gas, and they take a lot of time to be created naturally. So to get energy from fossil fuels, we need to burn them, and that can also cause a release of greenhouse gas into the environment. And mining and transport of fossil fuels can also be detrimental to our environment.
Right, so alternative energies could be a good source to not have to use as many fossil fuels. We also know that our population is growing, and so even if we had the same amount of fossil fuels that we have today forever, we know that that wouldn't be enough because our energy needs continue to grow because our population is growing, and also as we have more and more people entering into new generations, we have people that use more energy. Like the younger crowd tends to use more energy than some of the older crowds. So this graph shows you by 2040, we expect to need 56% more energy than we did in 2010. So our energy needs continue to increase. We know that fossil fuels won't last forever, and so there is a real need for alternative energies.
Right, and in addition to alternative energies, one way to bridge the gap for our energy use is to help decrease it as well. But back to alternatives, solar and wind energy are well developed, but ocean energy is still not grid ready on the East Coast. So one of our big focuses at CSI is finding the available resources that might be needed to put turbines in the Gulf Stream that can create electricity.
And so remember that the Gulf Stream is a warm water current that flows up past our coast. And so it flows at about 5 miles an hour on average constantly. So unlike some of those other alternative energy sources like solar and wind, the sun's not always shining, the wind's not always blowing. The Gulf Stream is a potential source of energy that would be constant. And our oceanographer is going to tell you a little bit more about what we're trying to do at CSI and a little bit more about the Gulf Stream.
My name's Mike Mulia. I'm a research associate in the Ocean Energy Program at the UNC Coastal Studies Institute, and I study the Gulf Stream. We're trying to understand whether the Gulf Stream is a viable source of ocean energy for the state of North Carolina. The Gulf Stream is like a giant river in the ocean. The water is really warm. It's 76, 78 degrees Fahrenheit all year round, and it transports an enormous amount of water. So the Gulf Stream has a lot to do with what the currents are doing off of North Carolina and whether water flows offshore at Cape Hatteras from the continental shelf or whether it flows offshore further to the north, and a lot of that depends on what the Gulf Stream's position is off of Cape Hatteras. And we're funded here at the Coastal Studies Institute to study the Gulf Stream because it may be the only viable source of ocean energy for the state of North Carolina that could actually power homes for the entire state. The amount of water that flows off of Cape Hatteras in the Gulf Stream is immense. So there are different estimates from 60 to 90 sphere drips, which is a unit that we use in oceanography, and a sphere drip is 1 million cubic meters of water per second. Relatively speaking, it's between 35 and 45 times the amount of all the river flow in the entire world off of Cape Hatteras is what the amount of water that the Gulf Stream is moving. At this point, there is no turbine, large-scale turbine that's been designed and tested that could harness flow from the Gulf Stream as we envision it. So we envision something on the order of like a wind turbine, something that's 30 to maybe 100 meters in diameter, something almost the size of a football field rotating underwater. Those are the ideas that have been put forward, but again, it's very new. So it's a new technology. It's something that we're exploring now, trying to understand what the implications are and what kind of size you could put underneath the water. So if you imagine that you have a giant turbine underwater and you want to tie it with an anchor line or a mooring to the bottom, you have to understand what the current dynamics are, not just at the turbine, but along the mooring line or the different forces that the turbine might experience on either end of the propeller, because there are other flows of water other than the Gulf Stream where we're looking that flow beneath the Gulf Stream. And so we measure those flows, and we can inform the engineering community about what types of flows, what speeds, and what the velocity shears like this would be in the water column when they're designing something to take advantage of that energy. We deploy an acoustic Doppler current profiler in a pod that actually goes on the bottom, and it sits on the bottom and it measures what the currents are doing above it over nearly the entire water column every 10 minutes.
There it goes.
Woo! It looks good!
Woo! That was awesome. You can see it go down.
So every 10 minutes I'm taking a snapshot of what the current's doing above that instrument, and we have nearly 3 years of measurements at what we consider to be the optimal location for getting Gulf Stream power, and we're really starting to understand how that power density from the stream varies at the location that we've chosen. As the crow flies, it's almost straight east or straight offshore of Cape Hatteras, right where the land point is located. The reason that we've chosen that location is the shelf slope is extremely steep there, and what that does is constrain the variability and position of the Gulf Stream. And so the variability in position is least off of Cape Hatteras at the location that we've chosen after the Gulf Stream leaves the Florida Straits. So we've really focused on that. We've also focused on water depths that are probably going to be less than 400 meters at this point, just to keep the expense of getting that energy down. I think when we talk about the Coastal Studies Institute's Ocean Energy Program, it's essential to mention all the partners that have made grand contributions to what we do. UNC Chapel Hill, NC State University, UNC Charlotte, all of these folks, all of these researchers play an essential role in our understanding of ocean energy here in North Carolina, and they've contributed countless hours to doing so. I think it's important because we need to diversify our sources of energy, right? We consume a lot of energy, and we don't know how long energy from non-renewable sources will be available from oil and coal. So it might be in our best interest to look at other sources of energy that don't do as much damage to the environment.
Well, it sounds like there are still a few things that need to be figured out, but it really is exciting work.
Well, that's all we have for you today. Thank you for attending. That was an introduction to 2 of the programs that we can offer virtually. We also have activities and other videos that will accompany these programs. And while we may not get to see you in person this year, we hope to continue to have your schools visit us in the future. For more information about anything you've seen today, especially with the teacher lesson plans and the student activities, please visit our website at coastalinstitute.org. And now we have time for any questions.
Right now, I don't see any, but Paul says hello.
Oh, good. Hi, Paul. Well, maybe we'll wait just a couple minutes and see if anybody has any questions. If not, we really appreciate you tuning in today. Needs like the Jeopardy song to play.
Can you hook me up to this thing again
Yeah,
so I can
while we wait.
go back and forth, do some swimming?
Oh, I might need this part. There you go.
What if it took you that quick underwater like that?
All right. Anyone that wants to type in how many times they think Parker can go up and down before she gets tired, we'll take your predictions.
It's not going to be too long. Here's a question. Oh, nope. Thank you for the presentation.
Perfect. All right. Well, if you have any other questions, you can email us and we'll be happy to answer them at a later time. Thank you all and have a great day.
See y'all. Thanks.